As Nathan confronted Claire in the heart-stopping moment of truth, the facade of their once perfect family shattered. Evidence of betrayal, stolen funds, and years of lies left no room for escape. Claire's tearful confession and Brandon's public downfall marked a turning point that would forever change their lives. But amidst the chaos, a question lingered. Could Nathan and Mason rebuild from the ruins, or would the scars of betrayal define their future? But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story. Mason Reed, an ambitious 18-year-old high school senior, looked up to his family as a beacon of trust and love. His father, Nathan, a dedicated and respected doctor, embodied integrity, while his mother, Claire, a charismatic charity organizer, carried an untarnished reputation. Together, they seemed to represent everything Mason aspired to build in his own future. Nathan's unwavering support and Claire's warm presence created a household where Mason felt secure. But when an anonymous letter arrived, hinting at secrets that could unravel everything Mason believed in, he was left wondering, how well did he truly know his family? It was an ordinary evening in the Reed household, the kind of quiet moment Mason had always taken for granted. Nathan was seated at the dining table, immersed in patient files, while Claire hummed softly as she tidied up the kitchen. Mason, sprawled out on the living room couch, was half-heartedly scrolling through his phone when he noticed an envelope tucked beneath a stack of mail. Unlike the usual assortment of bills and advertisements, this envelope was plain, unmarked, and addressed to his father in bold black letters. Curiosity got the better of him. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, noting the absence of a return address. It felt oddly out of place, almost ominous, but he couldn't explain why. Unable to resist, he slipped the envelope into his pocket, telling himself he would hand it to Nathan later. Later that night, when everyone else had gone to bed, Mason sat at his desk with the letter in front of him. A gnawing feeling in his gut told him this wasn't just a piece of junk mail. He carefully opened it, the sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the stillness. Inside was a single sheet of paper with bold, typewritten words that made his breath catch. "Nathan, you deserve to know the truth. Claire has been unfaithful to you for years. There's a good chance Mason isn't your biological son. Don't let her lies destroy you any further." The words swam in front of Mason's eyes as disbelief and panic collided. He read the letter again and again, hoping to find a clue that it was some sort of cruel joke. But there was no signature, no explanation, only the damning accusations. His mind raced. Was this real? Could his mother have been unfaithful? Could his entire life be built on a lie? He wanted to wake Nathan immediately, but fear paralyzed him. What if it wasn't true? What if bringing this up tore their family apart for no reason? Mason folded the letter back into the envelope and hid it in his desk drawer. For the first time in his life, Mason wasn't sure who he could trust. The family he had always viewed as unshakable suddenly felt fragile. Could he uncover the truth without destroying the people he loved most? For the next few days, Mason carried the weight of the letter like a heavy stone in his chest. He couldn't bring himself to show it to Nathan or confront Claire. What if the accusations were lies meant to drive a wedge between them? And yet, the idea of ignoring it felt impossible. Every time he looked at his parents, the words of the letter echoed in his mind. Claire has been unfaithful. Mason might not be Nathan's son. Determined to figure out the truth, Mason decided to watch and wait. He began paying closer attention to his parents' interactions, scrutinizing every conversation, every glance, every subtle shift in tone. At first, everything seemed normal, too normal. Claire's cheerful demeanor and Nathan's steady, composed presence were exactly as they had always been. But as the days passed, Mason started noticing cracks in the facade. Nathan, who usually engaged in lively dinner conversations, had become unusually quiet. He seemed distracted, his attention often drifting away from the table to some invisible worry. His responses to Claire were curt, almost mechanical, as though he were holding something back. Claire, on the other hand, was more animated than ever, her smile a little too bright, her laughter a little too forced. Mason noticed her spending more time on her phone, quickly putting it away when anyone entered the room. Once, he walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and saw her talking in hushed tones. When she noticed him, she ended the call abruptly and offered a strained explanation about charity logistics. The tension between them was subtle but undeniable. It was in the way Nathan avoided eye contact with Claire and the way she seemed to overcompensate with her cheerfulness. It was in the long silences that filled the space where their easy conversations used to flow. Mason also began to piece together fragments of conversations he hadn't paid attention to before. He remembered his parents arguing late at night, their voices muffled but clearly tense. Words like trust and responsibility surfaced in his memory, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now he replayed those moments in his mind, wondering if they were signs of deeper problems he had been too naive to notice. The more Mason observed, the more conflicted he became. Part of him wanted to believe in his parents' goodness, to trust that their love for each other and for him was unshakable. But the evidence, small scattered pieces, was beginning to add up. He couldn't ignore the changes in their behavior, the unease that seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken truth. Late at night, alone in his room, Mason often found himself staring at the envelope hidden in his desk drawer. Should he confront them? Should he demand answers? Or should he stay silent, hoping the tension would pass and life would return to normal? But deep down, Mason knew there was no going back to the way things were. The letter had planted a seed of doubt that was growing with every passing day. As he watched his parents from the shadows of his own uncertainty, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. Mason's suspicions deepened as he began noticing patterns in Claire's behavior that didn't align with her usual routines. She had always been a dedicated organizer for her charity, often putting in long hours to ensure its success, but lately, her work commitments seemed more personal than professional. Mason couldn't ignore how she left the house dressed impeccably, her phone always clutched tightly in her hand. She was evasive about where she was going, offering vague explanations that felt rehearsed. One afternoon, Mason decided to follow her. His heart pounded as he trailed Claire's car at a safe distance, trying to keep his nerves in check. She pulled into a high-end cafe downtown, the kind of place that catered to the city's wealthy elite. Mason parked his car a block away and walked in behind her, keeping his head low. Claire greeted a man seated at a corner table, a tall, confident figure Mason recognized from one of her charity galas. Brandon Hayes, a prominent philanthropist, was known for his generous donations and suave demeanor. Mason had met him once and remembered thinking how charming the man was, but now, his presence only heightened Mason's anxiety. Mason slid into a booth out of sight, close enough to overhear fragments of their conversation. At first, they spoke about the charity, its events, funding, and future projects. But then the tone shifted. Claire lowered her voice, her posture leaning in closer. Words like discretion and timing stood out, making Mason's stomach churn. Brandon responded with a reassuring tone, but there was something unsettling about the way he smiled and reached for her hand briefly before pulling back. Mason couldn't hear every word, but the intimate undertones were undeniable. His chest tightened as he watched his mother laugh softly at something Brandon said, her expression warmer than it had been at home in weeks. It wasn't overtly romantic, but it was far from professional. Later that evening, Mason replayed what he had seen and heard, trying to make sense of it. His confusion and frustration grew when he noticed Nathan's increasing absence. His father, once the cornerstone of their family dinners and weekend outings, had become a ghost in their home. Nathan now spent most of his time at the hospital, working late hours and leaving early in the morning. When Mason tried to engage him in conversation, Nathan's responses were distracted, his focus elsewhere. The once vibrant dynamic between his parents now felt like a charade. They were rarely in the same room together, and when they were, their interactions were perfunctory at best. Nathan's polite but distant demeanor contrasted starkly with Claire's forced cheerfulness, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that Mason couldn't escape. As Mason connected the dots, the letter's accusations gained more weight. Was Brandon the reason for Nathan's withdrawal? Were the suspicions about Claire not just baseless claims, but a dark truth? The idea that his family was unraveling piece by piece left Mason in turmoil. He knew he had to dig deeper, but every step toward the truth felt like a step closer to breaking the fragile remnants of his family. How much longer could he bear the weight of these secrets before confronting them head-on? Mason felt like he was caught in an impossible web of emotions. Every day he carried the crushing weight of what he had seen, heard, and read, but he couldn't bring himself to confront his parents. The idea of Nathan, the man he had idolized his entire life, Learning about the contents of the letter and what Mason had witnessed filled him with dread. At the same time, the image of Claire laughing with Brandon at the cafe haunted him, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about his mother. He found himself overanalyzing every moment at home, Nathan's distant behavior, Claire's overly cheerful facade. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle Mason couldn't quite solve. Part of him wanted to believe that there was a reasonable explanation for everything, that his family wasn't falling apart. But the doubts grew louder with each passing day, and his once unshakable trust in his parents began to crumble. Mason's struggle was compounded by the fear of what the truth might do to his family. If he confronted Nathan with the letter, would it push him further away? If he accused Claire outright, would it lead to a confrontation that tore their home apart? He couldn't bear the thought of being the one to destroy the family he loved, even if it was already breaking behind closed doors. His internal conflict seeped into every aspect of his life. At school, Mason found it hard to concentrate, his mind constantly wandering back to the letter and the scene at the cafe. Friends noticed his distraction, but he brushed off their concerns, unwilling to share the burden he carried. Even his hobbies, things he once enjoyed, felt hollow, as if the weight of the secrets had drained all joy from them. Late at night, Mason often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moments he'd observed and questioning whether he was making the right choice by staying silent. Could he protect his family and uncover the truth at the same time? Or would one inevitably destroy the other? The more he wrestled with these questions, the more trapped he felt, as if the walls of his once happy home were closing in on him. Mason realized he couldn't live in limbo forever. At some point, he would have to make a choice. But how could he decide between loyalty to his family and the need to face the painful truth? The knot in Mason's stomach tightened as he decided to take the next step. His observations, the letter, and Claire's behavior had led him here, to a moment where he had to know the truth. One rainy afternoon, when Claire said she had another important meeting for the charity, Mason saw his opportunity. He grabbed his jacket and keys and quietly followed her car as it pulled away from the driveway. She drove across town to a quiet cafe, far from the usual places she frequented. Mason parked a safe distance away and entered the cafe, keeping to the shadows. Claire was already seated at a corner table, her back to the door. Moments later, Brandon and Hayes walked in, his confidence. At first, their conversation appeared innocent, talk of the charity, upcoming events, and logistics. But as Mason inched closer, pretending to browse the menu on a nearby counter, the tone shifted. Claire's voice grew strained, and Brandon leaned forward, his expression hard. Snippets of their conversation drifted toward Mason. "You promised me discretion, Brandon," Claire said in a hushed but urgent tone. "And you promised to keep Nathan out of this," Brandon shot back. "But he's not stupid, Claire. He's already suspicious." Mason's heart pounded. The way Brandon spoke to Claire, the familiarity in their argument, it was undeniable. This wasn't just a professional relationship. As their voices grew more heated, Brandon reached across the table, his hand brushing hers before Claire pulled away. "This has gone too far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep lying." Brandon scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You've already lied to him for years. What's one more secret?" Unable to bear hearing anymore, Mason left the cafe, his hands shaking. The truth was clear now. Claire and Brandon were romantically involved, and this wasn't a recent affair. This had been going on for years, hidden behind the facade of Claire's charity work. But the revelation wasn't over. Desperate for answers, Mason made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. Using a DNA testing kit he purchased online, he discreetly collected samples from himself and Nathan. It was an agonizing wait, the days dragging as Mason imagined every possible outcome. The test confirmed his worst fear. There was a significant probability that Nathan was not his biological father. The words on the screen blurred as Mason's vision filled with tears. His world tilted on its axis. If Nathan wasn't his father, who was? And what did that make him? Mason sat in his room, staring blankly at the results, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. His entire identity, his sense of self, his place in the family, was suddenly in question. Everything he had believed about his life felt like a lie. How could he face Nathan with this? How could he confront Claire? One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Mason knew he couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. The weight of the letter, the argument he witnessed, and the DNA results had become too much to bear. He had to tell Nathan, even if it meant shattering their already fragile family. One evening, as Nathan returned from work and settled in his study, Mason mustered the courage to knock on the door, clutching the letter and DNA results tightly in his hand. Nathan looked up, surprised by Mason's serious expression. "What's on your mind, son?" Mason hesitated, his throat dry. "Dad, I need to show you something. I found this a while ago and—" He stopped, his voice trembling as he handed Nathan the letter. He sat in silence as Nathan read it, his face slowly hardening with every word. Then Mason placed the DNA results on the desk, his hands shaking. "I didn't want to believe it, but after everything I've seen, I thought you deserved to know," Mason whispered, barely holding back tears. Nathan sat back, the letter in one hand, the DNA results in the other. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was deafening. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded grimly. "Thank you for telling me, Mason. I need to talk to your mother." That night, Nathan confronted Claire. Mason sat at the top of the stairs, his heart pounding as muffled voices rose and fell. At first, Claire denied everything, her voice defensive and sharp, but as Nathan presented the evidence, the letter, the results, and Mason's observations, her defiance crumbled. Her voice broke as she tearfully admitted to the affair, confessing that her relationship with Brandon had started years ago. "It was a mistake," Claire sobbed. "It didn't mean anything. I never wanted it to hurt you or Mason." Nathan's voice, usually calm and composed, was now filled with anger and pain. "A mistake? Years of betrayal are not a mistake, Claire, and Mason, our son, doesn't even know who he is anymore because of you." Claire's sobs grew louder, but her words became quieter. "I thought I could protect him, protect all of us. I didn't want this to come out." "Protect him?" Nathan's voice cracked. "You've destroyed his sense of identity and this family." The confrontation ended with Nathan packing a bag and walking out the door. As Mason watched from his bedroom window, he felt an overwhelming sense of abandonment. His father, the anchor of their family, was gone, leaving him to face the fallout with Claire. Claire tried to console Mason, pleading for his forgiveness. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Mason. I was trying to protect you." But Mason couldn't bring himself to respond. Her words felt hollow, and he could see in her eyes that she was still holding back. The full extent of her involvement with Brandon remained a mystery, and Mason couldn't trust anything she said. In the days that followed, the house felt emptier than ever. Mason was caught between anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. His family had been shattered, and the one person he thought he could always count on, Nathan, was gone. How could he rebuild his life from the ruins of their broken home? Nathan's departure from the house didn't signify the end of his fight. It marked the beginning of his resolve to uncover the full extent of the damage Brandon Hayes had caused. Fueled by betrayal and a desire for justice, Nathan redirected his pain into action. He began quietly investigating Brandon, determined to expose the man who had not only destroyed his family, but also betrayed the trust of countless others who supported the charity. Nathan's suspicions were initially sparked by inconsistencies in the charity's financial records, which he had overheard Claire discussing with Brandon during their arguments. Using his professional connections as a respected doctor and his keen analytical mind, Nathan began piecing together the puzzle. He reached out to contacts in finance and law enforcement, requesting access to public records and donations made to the charity. At first, Mason was hesitant to get involved. The wounds of his parents' confrontation were still fresh, and he was grappling with his own identity crisis. But when Nathan asked for his help, Mason agreed. It was a chance to rebuild the bond with his father and find some measure of closure. Together, they began combing through charity reports, donor lists, and payment records. Mason's attention to detail proved invaluable. He noticed patterns in the transactions. Unusually large sums of money funneled through vague accounts, and discrepancies between reported donations and expenditures. As they dug deeper, they found undeniable proof. Brandon had been embezzling funds from the charity for years, siphoning money into his personal accounts while covering his tracks with fraudulent bookkeeping. The evidence alone wasn't enough. Nathan knew they needed corroboration from others involved in the charity. He and Mason reached out to former employees and current board members, carefully selecting individuals who might have noticed irregularities but were too afraid to speak up. Slowly, they built a network of people willing to testify, each with their own piece of the puzzle. One former accountant revealed how Brandon had pressured her into altering records. Another whistleblower, a volunteer, shared emails that hinted at Brandon's manipulation of Claire to keep her complicit in his scheme. Each new testimony strengthened their case, but it also brought Mason face to face with the extent of Claire's involvement. She wasn't just an unwitting victim. She had played a role in hiding Brandon's crimes, whether out of fear, loyalty, or self-preservation. As Nathan and Mason worked together, their strained relationship began to heal. The shared mission gave them a sense of purpose and unity, even in the face of such betrayal. Nathan often reassured Mason, reminding him that their bond wasn't defined by DNA. "You're my son, Mason," he said firmly one evening. "Nothing will ever change that." The case against Brandon grew stronger by the day. With each piece of evidence they uncovered, Nathan and Mason felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about holding Brandon accountable. It was about restoring integrity to the charity, finding closure, and proving that no one could get away with such betrayal unscathed. But as they prepared to make their findings public, they knew the hardest part was yet to come. Would the truth bring justice, or would it lead to even more devastating consequences for their family? Nathan couldn't let Claire's role in Brandon's schemes go unaddressed. With the evidence he and Mason had gathered, he decided it was time to confront her again. This time, there would be no room for deflection or half-truths. Nathan knew exactly what Claire had done to keep Brandon's corruption hidden, and he was determined to hear her admit it. He found her at home, sitting at the dining table, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. When Nathan walked in, her expression faltered, a mix of guilt and dread crossing her face. "We need to talk, Claire," he said, his voice firm but calm. Claire hesitated, clearly bracing herself. "Nathan, if this is about—" "It's about the charity," Nathan interrupted. He placed a folder of documents on the table in front of her. "And your involvement in Brandon's embezzlement." Her eyes widened as she glanced at the papers, then back at him. "I don't know what you think you found, but—" "Stop," Nathan said sharply. "I know everything. The altered records, the missing funds, the emails between you and Brandon. You helped him cover this up, Claire. Don't insult me by pretending you didn't." Claire's facade crumbled, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't have a choice, Nathan," she said, her voice trembling. "He threatened to drag me down with him if I didn't help. Do you know what that would have done to me? To us?" "Us?" Nathan's voice rose in disbelief. "There hasn't been an us in a long time, Claire, and you didn't protect this family. You protected yourself, your reputation, your image. You let him destroy everything we built." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to explain. "I was scared, Nathan. I didn't know how to fix it. I thought if I just went along with it, I could make it right somehow." Nathan shook his head, his anger tempered by disappointment. "You didn't just make a mistake, Claire. You chose to protect a man who betrayed our family and countless others, and in doing so, you betrayed us too." Mason, who had been listening from the hallway, stepped into the room. His expression was hard, his resolve clear. "You let him get away with it because you cared more about what people thought of you than what was right. But I don't care about your reputation, Mom. I care about the truth." Claire looked at her son, her face pale. "Mason, I didn't mean for any of this to hurt you." "It doesn't matter what you meant," Mason replied. "What matters is what you did." Mason's disillusionment with Claire was complete. He had always seen her as the warm, caring presence in their home, but now he couldn't reconcile that image with the woman who had been complicit in Brandon's crimes. Determined to see justice served, Mason made his decision. "We're exposing this," he said, his voice steady. "All of it. Brandon, the embezzlement, everything. People deserve to know the truth, even if it means the world finds out what you did." Nathan nodded in agreement. "It's time to end this. No more lies." Claire sat silently, tears falling as the weight of her actions and their consequences settled around her. Mason walked away, his resolve unshaken. For him, the cost of the truth was worth it, no matter how painful the fallout would be. The day of the charity's board meeting arrived with an air of tension that Nathan and Mason could almost touch. The stakes were monumental. This was their chance to expose Brandon Hayes and Claire's role in his corruption. Nathan had arranged the meeting, ensuring every key member of the board would be present. This wasn't going to be a private revelation. It would be a reckoning in full view of the people who had trusted Brandon and Claire to lead with integrity. Nathan and Mason entered the room, carrying folders of meticulously organized evidence. The board members, an assortment of wealthy donors and influential community leaders, greeted them with polite curiosity, unaware of the storm about to hit. Brandon was already seated at the head of the table, his charm on full display as he greeted everyone warmly. Claire sat beside him, her expression strained, her usual composure faltering under the weight of what she knew was coming. She avoided Nathan's gaze, while Brandon, oblivious to the brewing confrontation, looked as confident as ever. Nathan cleared his throat and stood. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "I've called this meeting to discuss matters that are deeply concerning and demand immediate attention." The room quieted as Nathan and Mason began their presentation. They started with financial reports, projecting slides that detailed discrepancies between reported donations and actual expenditures. Mason took the lead, explaining the patterns he had uncovered with a precision that impressed even the most skeptical board members. Brandon shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor cracking as the evidence mounted. "What exactly are you suggesting, Nathan?" he interrupted, his voice tinged with irritation. Nathan didn't miss a beat. "I'm not suggesting anything, Brandon. I'm presenting facts. Facts that show you've been embezzling funds from this charity for years." Gasps erupted around the table. Brandon's face turned pale, and his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "This is absurd," he said, trying to laugh it off. "Where's your proof?" Nathan gestured to Mason, who displayed emails, altered financial records, and testimony from former employees. The final blow came when Nathan revealed a recorded conversation between Brandon and Claire, in which they discussed covering up the missing funds. "Claire," Nathan said, turning to her, "you've been complicit in hiding Brandon's crimes. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Claire's face crumpled. She looked around the room, seeing the shocked faces of people she had worked with for years. I didn't know what to do," she stammered. "I thought I was protecting the charity." "Protecting the charity?" one board member echoed incredulously. "You've destroyed its reputation." The room descended into chaos as board members voiced their outrage. Brandon stood abruptly, his mask of charm replaced by anger. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You have no right." "We have every right," Nathan said coldly. "This isn't just unethical, it's criminal, and the authorities will agree." As if on cue, 2 police officers entered the room. Nathan had coordinated with law enforcement, ensuring they were ready to act once the evidence was presented. Brandon was handcuffed on the spot, his protest drowned out by the murmurs of the board members. Claire watched in stunned silence, her face pale and drawn. Following Brandon's arrest, the fallout was swift and brutal. Claire was forced to resign from the charity, her once spotless reputation in tatters. The community she had once charmed turned against her, and she became a social pariah. Former friends distanced themselves, and her presence at any event was met with whispers and cold stares. The charity, now leaderless and embroiled in scandal, faced a crisis of survival. Donations plummeted as the story spread, tarnishing its name and undoing years of goodwill. Nathan felt a pang of regret for the innocent employees and beneficiaries affected by the collapse, but he knew the truth had to come out. For Mason, the public exposure brought a mix of relief and sadness. The corruption had been revealed and justice was being served, but it came at a cost. His family was irreparably broken, and his mother, despite her faults, was now a shell of her former self. Still, Mason stood firm in his belief. The truth was worth it. Some wounds needed to be exposed before healing could begin. The public exposure of Brandon's embezzlement was only the beginning of Nathan's quest for justice. With Brandon behind bars awaiting trial, Nathan worked tirelessly to ensure the man faced the full weight of the law. Collaborating with law enforcement and prosecutors, he provided every piece of evidence he and Mason had gathered, leaving no room for doubt about Brandon's guilt. Former employees and board members who had been coerced into silence now came forward, emboldened by Nathan's resolve. Brandon's trial was swift and damning. The evidence of his financial crimes was overwhelming, and his attempts to deny or deflect only further tarnished his credibility. The court sentenced him to a lengthy prison term and ordered him to repay the stolen funds, a sum so large it ensured he would never regain his affluent lifestyle. His name, once synonymous with philanthropy, became a symbol of greed and deceit. Nathan didn't stop there. Determined to prevent Brandon from rebuilding his reputation, he ensured the community knew the full extent of his betrayal. Articles detailing Brandon's crime circulated widely, fueled by Nathan's connections to local journalists and community leaders. Even those who had once admired Brandon turned their backs on him, disgusted by his actions. With Brandon's downfall complete, Nathan turned his attention to Claire. The trust and love he had once felt for her were irrevocably shattered, replaced by a cold determination to sever all ties. Filing for divorce, Nathan cited infidelity and fraud, laying out the emotional and financial betrayals she had inflicted on their family. Back when the divorce proceedings were tense and bitter, Claire attempted to argue for leniency, painting herself as a victim of Brandon's manipulation, but Nathan's legal team dismantled her claims, presenting evidence of her complicity and her efforts to protect her reputation at the expense of their family. The judge's ruling was decisive. Claire would receive minimal financial support, just enough to meet basic needs, but far from the comfortable lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. For Claire, the reality of her new circumstances was a harsh wake-up call. Her lavish dinners, designer clothes, and social status were gone, replaced by a modest apartment and whispers of disgrace wherever she went. She reached out to Nathan and Mason multiple times, seeking reconciliation or at least some measure of forgiveness. But "There's no going back, Claire," Nathan said during one of her attempts to plead her case. "You made your choices, now you'll have to live with them." Mason, too, kept his distance. While he wrestled with his emotions, the pain of her betrayal was too fresh to forgive. He saw her not as the mother who had once been his source of comfort, but as a person who had allowed selfishness to destroy their family. Nathan's actions sent a clear message: betrayal would not go unpunished, and integrity would always prevail. He and Mason focused on rebuilding their lives, unburdened by the weight of deception and manipulation. Though the road ahead was uncertain, they both knew they were stronger for having faced the truth. For Nathan, ensuring justice and cutting ties with Claire marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by resilience and hope. Nathan and Mason's decision to move to a new home marked the start of their journey to rebuild their lives. The house was modest compared to their old one, but it felt like a fresh start, a place free from the shadows of betrayal. They worked together to unpack boxes and arrange furniture, small acts that symbolized their effort to create a new foundation. For Nathan, this was a chance to focus on being the father Mason needed. For Mason, it was an opportunity to redefine his identity beyond the chaos that had upended their family. Their relationship grew stronger in this new environment. Without the weight of Claire's presence or the tension that had filled their previous home, they found comfort in each other's company. They talked openly, something they hadn't done in years, sharing their hopes, fears, and plans for the future. Nathan used these moments to teach Mason lessons about integrity and resilience, drawing from his own experiences to guide his son through the pain. "Life will test you," Nathan told Mason one evening as they sat on their porch. "But it's how you respond that defines who you are. Always choose to stand for what's right, even when it's hard." Meanwhile, Claire's downfall was stark and lonely. Stripped of her social status and financial security, she struggled to adjust to a life without the luxuries and connections she had once taken for granted. She tried reaching out to Mason multiple times, calling and sending messages pleading for a chance to make amends. Mason, however, was unyielding. "I can't just forget what you did, Mom," Mason told her during one brief conversation. "You have to take responsibility for your actions. Until you do, there's nothing more to say." The rejection stung, but Mason knew it was necessary. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to be earned, not begged for. Nathan, while still grappling with his own pain and anger, chose to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. He poured his energy into his work, his relationship with Mason, and personal growth. He took up hobbies he had long neglected, finding joy in simple things that reminded him of the life he wanted to build. Their new beginning wasn't without its challenges, but it was theirs, a testament to their strength and determination to heal. Together, Nathan and Mason proved that even in the wake of betrayal, It was possible to rise, rebuild, and move forward with hope. As the dust settled from the chaos of betrayal and revelations, Mason found himself transformed. The pain he had endured and the strength he witnessed in his father became a driving force in his life. Determined to channel his experiences into something meaningful, Mason decided to pursue a career in law. Inspired by Nathan's unwavering fight for justice and integrity, Mason resolved to help others navigate their struggles and find justice, just as he and his father had. Nathan, too, found peace in the aftermath. By standing up for himself and his family, he had reclaimed his sense of worth and purpose. No longer burdened by the weight of Claire's deception, Nathan could focus on the future, guiding Mason and cherishing the bond they had rebuilt. His journey taught him that betrayal, though devastating, didn't have to define the rest of his life. Instead, together, Nathan and Mason looked forward to brighter days ahead. Their journey from betrayal to redemption had been painful, but it had also been transformative. They learned that strength comes from facing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, and that hope can be found even in the darkest moments. Life's challenges can break us or make us stronger. It's our choice. Betrayal and loss are deeply painful, but they also hold the potential for growth, healing, and transformation. By standing for what's right, embracing resilience, and focusing on the future, we can turn pain into strength and move toward a brighter tomorrow.